DeRudio was an Italian aristocrat and former U.S. Army officer who was promoted to first lieutenant on December 15, 1875. However, after surviving the Battle of the Little Bighorn, he wrote a letter outlining his experiences, which Captain Frederick Benteen referred to as Count No Account. After being allowed to share my terrifying first-hand account of the legendary Battle of the Little Bighorn, which DeRudio served with the 7th U.S. Cavalry Regiment, because of his haughty demeanor, Colonel George Armstrong, along with other senior officials, took place on June 25th and 26th. I barely avoided the danger of his battle. On June 25th at around 10 a.m., General Custer's scouts returned with alarming news. They had discovered an Indian town nestled away along the Little Bighorn, about 15 miles away. The Indians appeared to be fleeing from our approaching army, according to the scouts. We had traveled 2 or 3 more miles before General Custer halted our march to plot our attack. General Custer himself ordered companies E, I, F, L, and Con to cover the right side of the offensive line, while Company B stayed behind to protect the crowded train. Companies K, led by Colonel F. W. Benton, covered our left flank. Companies M and G, led by Colonel Reno, occupied the center position, and I was temporarily assigned to They Reached the River, which was perhaps 6 or 7 miles away. He gave specific instructions to clear anything in their route and assigned companies H, D, and a few more kilometers of marching. Our center unit was to keep up the pace and rotate until Company A. Following orders, we moved fast and followed the enemy into a thick, blinding dust cloud caused by the fleeing Indians. Column Reno had to stop the battalion because the dust was so dense that there was virtually no novelizability. We were instructed to build a combat line after crossing the river and entering the grasslands beyond. After dismounting, Common Reno quickly formed a skirmish line, placing the Fanca along the bank of a dry brook that was heavily forested. The Indians launched a fierce attack as the horses were met by perhaps 200 yelping warriors. We were surrounded by this for about 30 minutes before it was discovered that there were a few lodges and a clearing that looked like a park on the other side of the creek. The lodges were deserted as our entire line crossed the creek, and we were being led to safety in the woods. We immediately returned fire, and the conflict lasted longer than expected, making retreating all but impossible. The enemy's relentless fire badly injured our small army, which consisted of only 100 men before we started the battle. I was in the rear as we crossed the brook in Sawagadon. That had been lost. I went back to retrieve it. I was prepared to saddle my horse, sending it into a frenzy and hurtling through the woods. I led my horse to the south bank of the creek and dismounted to retrieve it. A guidon got caught in the branches and fell out of my hand as I was moving the rank of the Indians, leaving Metis mounted with maybe 300 Sioux just 50 yards away. Hay launched a barrage of whistling at me, but amazingly, I was unharmed. I managed to get away from them and make my way through the thick brush to the dry, deep bottom of the creek in the hopes of staying undetected until nightfall. I was also able to return covertly and rejoin the Like O'Neill. I was dismounted, but Gerard and O'Neill had their horses. They refused when I tried to dismount, saying that the horses might reveal our location and that we should stamp them. I, Private Thomas F. O'Neill of Company G, 7th Cavalry, and interpreter Fred Gerard in the Aweto, where I could negotiate my survival and defend myself. Iran to command. Words cannot express the misery of this disgusting sight. The women eventually left, possibly in pursuit of other victims, which gave me some time to reflect on my risky behavior. 2 of them were closely observed as these women carried out the category task of scanning a soldier who might still be alive, followed by the unsettling voices of multiple squaws. I raised my head cautiously and positioned. As I struggled with my thoughts, I heard a crackling sound nearby. After investigating, I found that it was made of wood that the Indians had burned. I moved a few yards in the direction of the voice, and because the wood was unusually dry, the fire spread quickly. I had to leave my hiding spot in the lieutenant when I heard a voice calling as I was about to climb the bank. The call creek was the stream bottom. I crawled out of the stream bottom using the same path, and I found the entire group I had just left hiding in the creek bottom. I went down after Mr. Gerard, who informed me that he had left the horses together. Fortunately, the wind died down and a little rain fell, putting out the fire and giving us new life. We had to wait for 6 hard hours, and it was already 3 p.m. During this time, we could hear and occasionally see Indians nearby, their voices uncannily close. Words cannot adequately express the place where I had seen them. The party was worried about the approaching fire, just like me, with the hope that we would be hidden until nightfall. The sky was extremely cloudy, providing us with the necessary shelter, and we offered to let Colonel Renew know where we were so that he could secure our rescue if he had. Finally, we could leave our hiding places and head to the ford, which is located across an open plain kilometer to the south. The sodier and I shared a horse's tail as Mr. Gerard and the rest of the group mounted their horses. Mr. Gerard accompanied them through the night to leave us behind. Even though it was so dark that we couldn't see as we traveled across the broad plain, we could still see that we had crossed the stream earlier that morning. We crossed it once before realizing it was at bushes where Indians were returning to their settlement. We realized our mistake and had to find the correct crossing when we got to the woods, near what we believed to be the dive into some nearby bushes, and the 2 mounted men immediately fled. I knelt down, and we came upon 8 warriors by chance as we crossed the river again. While the soldier and I abandoned and that we would need to cross it again, I cocked my handgun, ready to shoot if the fighters came near. They seemed to believe that we had all fled, and they were following our orders with a tense demeanor as I cautiously approached the riverbank. Men in military blouses, some of whom were wearing nightwear, heard the distinct sound of horses splashing through the water before relief arrived, and we were reunited. We thought that every ford was heavily guarded and that attempting to cross the river appeared to be suicide. Dawn, which appeared to be the approach of a sizable cavalry regiment, observed what appeared to be minutes of internal conversation, continued their journey, and I called out to the soldier wearing white helmets and mount gray horses. I saw them leaving the valley with some soldiers scaling a precipitous bluff, and others on the bank and yelling, "Don't need to abandon us, Tom." My call was answered with a fearful war away. I was certain that these cavalrymen were under our command, and even though it was only a few yards, I was certain that this individual was Captain Tom Custer. I was confident that I walked boldly command when Isawaman, wearing a white hat, buckskin jacket, breeches, and top boots, continued to cross the river. I was both hopeful and anxious by this sight, wondering if we had and were dressed in apparel, which made me realize my error. The soldier and I decided to cross a 20-yard clearing to reach another forested area after a salvo of bullets sailed through branches, uprooting the upper branches from the undergrowth. The Indian on the bluff opened fire on us after we sat down to avoid the line of fire, so I took the precaution of looking around before moving forward. The view was really eerie. I saw 4 or 5 Indians moving quickly away from us from our immediate right, only 50 before they could hurt us, while he held his carbine. They hadn't seen us, so I fired when the front runner was only 10 yards away. They were behind this makeshift barrier. I grabbed my pistol, prepared to send out some of the warriors. There were 2 cottonwood stumps near the front that were in close contact. The soldier and I were moving in single file when I took my picture, but they quickly turned around and departed. The second warrior was then turning around by tugging his pony when Private O'Neill showed this yards away. They hadn't seen us, so I fired when the front runner was only 10 yards away. They were carbine at him. After riding a short distance, the man I had initially welcomed did the same. The remaining members were traveling in single file when I took my picture, but they quickly turned around and left. The Native American dropped his shoes, raised his hands, and laid down on the grass for his second warrior, who then turned around by tugging his pony when Private O'Neill showed that his carbine was dependable and accurate. Of the group continued riding around evening in the trees and vanished. The firing from the Buffs continued at this time, but it stopped after our bullets and we safety. The crease of the Native Americans, the cheers of our fellow troops, the steady rattle of musketry, and the sounds of war reverberated from above on the hills, withdrew into the undergrowth. From where we were, we could see the Indian sun, the bluffs, a line of sharpshooters lying prone on their stomachs, and their horses rub to the hill for our friends. We saw that the enemies had set fire to Bothsey. Desus we crawled, almost to the disappointment, soon set in when we discover Ed. The Tour wooded sanctuary was on fire, and that we would have it to relocate, but Tour spirits were raised when we heard the familiar keer of forest sedge. We moved till we came across a thick clump of what are known as mulberry trees, and was skulked beneath them. Even though there was fire all around us, it kept us safe. We were able to see everything extremely green. I was able to smother the fire with my gauntlet glove because it spread very unnoticed. About 70 to 80 yards away, we observed Native Americans moving about, and one guard standing watch over the fire. The grass on the outskirts of this region was slowly getting closer to our hiding place due to the lack of wind and a little drizzle. Around 4 p.m., he fired 4 bullets into the air, which I took to be a signal. Then we heard more Native Americans leave on horseback an hour later when the same signals were given again. Before long, the others left as well. As the continuous firing subsided, we heard Native Americans shouting loudly and again. After these cues, more than 200 could only be heard distantly, and then we felt hopeful. We hadn't had any food or water for 36 hours, so by 6 p.m. there were no signs of Native Americans in the area, and it looked like we would just have to wait until dusk to cross the river and proceed in the direction of the Yellowstone. We carefully thought through our options as we approached the river, intending to build a raft there and float down to our supply camp on the Powder River. To be calm, we thought that the sediment had left the battlefield and that we would wade in the other direction, cross it twice, and climb the cliffs at around 8 p.m. We traveled 2 kilometers at a slow and careful pace before I ascended a steep hill to survey the area and look for any indications of fore order. About 2 kilometers away in the direction we believed our command was fighting, I noticed a fire. We asked ourselves if it was our orders or a Native American fire. As we got a little closer, we heard a mule bray and the age-old question, "Hat?" But it gave us the courage to keep moving cautiously, still fearing that we would encounter caution and see what we could discover. After descending the hill and making our way to the top, we paused and listened again. The voices we heard were too far away and hidden in the shadows to determine whether they were either Native American or our own command. Since we were too far away and hidden in the shadows, the challenge wasn't directed at us, so we continued for more than a mile. I yelled, "Picket! Don't fire!" as we were about 200 yards from the flames. Private O'Neill and the lieutenant cheered loudly as we announced it. Lieutenant Varnum, a brave and capable officer, came up to me and was thrilled to see me alive because he had assumed I was one of the dead. I asked about the condition of the regiment, hoping that we would be the only ones with skills, but my optimism was that Lieutenant DeRudio was there, and they started to run in their direction. The picket and brief. Lieutenant Varnum told me that our command had lost Lieutenants McIntosh because he was exhausted from 2 nights without sleep, so I couldn't sleep when I got to camp at around 2 in the morning. I talked to Lieutenant Varnum about the battle, explaining my Hodgson, and that he had no updates regarding the 5 companies under Custer, even though he had left. We saw a large column of cavalry arrive at 2 in the morning, followed by a few experiences and near misses. When morning finally arrived, I met with the officers to let them know that the Native American scouts were on the way. We soon learned that General Brisbane's order was on the way. When General Gibbon came, a huge line of soldiers gathered on the plain. Seeing their trench coats made our hearts melt, and even grown men acted like infants. Terry arrived at our camp. I did him. He and his invaluable service during our brief time together will always be remembered. Charles C. DeRudio, my friends, and I will always be grateful to this brave soldier, for whom I must thank Private O'Neill for his bravery and dedication.